Part two, guys. Part two. American
Get these
Maroon.
black people. So most likely they were already in Spain and they were prisoners of war from the Moorish conquest. So he brought these people over here. They set up a colony in the South Carolina, Georgia area. They called it San Miguel del Guadape. They were there for a few months. The black people rose up against the Spanish. They burned the village down, ran the Spanish out of here. The Spanish went back to the Caribbean. And then the black people blended in with the Aboriginal society here.
And so they're responsible for killing millions of people with diseases, not warfare. Now, when they write their history books and their movies, they're the gallant warriors with the shield. That's bullcrap. Their diseases debilitated us. In his diary, on his second voyage, he talks about the Ethiopians he meet, who shows him around. Balboa, who comes after him, said when he got to Mexico, he met these Ethiopian blacks. And he said they came from a town about 40 miles away that was all black. This is Balboa. This stuff is written in history.
The Spaniards began calling the people who ran away by these derogatory terms. Fierce, unruly. That's what Seminole means. Cimarron was that they were fierce, unruly, unkempt, runaway. These are some of the terms.
So right after the San Miguel del Guadape riot, when the black Moors ran out the Spanish and they blended in with the Native American tribes here, years later, Hernando de Soto came. And he explored Florida, he explored Georgia, he explored the North and South Carolina area, and he ran into a Native American tribe, and he saw that the queen, Lady of Cafetachequi, she had married one of the black Moorish Maroons. So this shows one of the early connections between the black and the Aboriginal people here in the Americas.
And they ran into a group of people who are my people. I'm from the Chicora Nation, as well as the African Nation. And so we rebelled, and we burned one of their ships, and one escaped back to the Dominican Republic. But what happened to all those Africans? We melted into the population of African and Native people who was already there all along. But that wasn't the first time when, who was it, the English explorer came? Drake. He dumped us there too, because he couldn't make it back. They were eating each other in order to make it back to England alive. He wouldn't even give us a chance, thank God. We got to go in the swamp and meet the family. And they had to eat each other to get home to England.
Some more explorers are Antonio Pigfagan. And Antonio Pigfagan is very significant because he traveled around the world with Magellan. And so as traveling around the world with Magellan, he's seen black people all over. And he knew the difference between a black person, because a lot of times they try to tell us, oh, well, these people are just kind of tannish or reddish, and they thought everybody was black. But Antonio Pigfagan traveled around the world. When he got to Brazil, he said these people who were making these giant canoes, these were black men. Looks like they came out the infernos of hell. That's what he said.
This book, The Shaping of Black America, by Dr. Lauren Bennett, there's a chapter in there called The Red and the Black, and he deals with that issue and how the European Americans solved the problem. They said, listen, they're all black. Let's just raid their villages and put them all in slavery.
People like Giovanni Veracino, who was an Italian explorer. He came to the Carolina area, and I believe this was 1524, somewhere around that nature. And he talked about the complexion of the people was black. He said not that much different from the Ethiopians. And what happens as well on his trip, a boy that is traveling with them on this journey in 1524, he actually gets caught out in the ocean. He almost drowns, and the natives save him. When they get the boy back, he tells them that these natives that saved him were black like the others. Okay, so this is something else in his letter. You can find this in the letter 1524 to Francis, King Francis.
A lot of Native Americans who had black phenotypes, they just got reclassified as Negro without them even knowing it. You had white supremacists like Walter Plecker working in the statistics office, Naomi Drake working down in New Orleans and Louisiana. Plecker, who was in Virginia, they went through all the records, him and his people, and saw anybody with any type of black phenotypes or anybody with any type of black ancestry or any Native American who could be perceived as black. They just reclassified them as Negro.
When they were doing archaeological and anthropological research on Jamestown, they went into, and Jamestown is allegedly the first successful English-speaking colony here in North America. When they went into the graveyard and they dug up what they said were quote-unquote Indians, the people's DNA came out African, and you haven't heard much about that since. I mean, who's got the red skin, really? Right? These people let you know these people copper. You got a copper color, right? I mean, these people, we see even these Plains Indians half the time aren't copper colored. So even what is an Indian in this country is a political and legal concept versus biological.
The revisionist historical narrative is that the white supremacists left Europe and brought civilization to the dark savages around the world. But it was black people who enlightened the Europeans at first, and there was early resistance against the white supremacists when they came to the Americas.
You had these major empires with multiple royal families who set the etiquette standards for the world, which is taken to Europe via the Moors. What did the Moors take to Europe? You took the culture of Africa to Europe. You took medicine, you took reading, you took science, you took astronomy, you took geometry, you took mathematics, not the Greeks. Europe wakes up and has its enlightenment after the invasion of the Moors, not before.
In the 1800s, you had a historian and archaeologist, Constantine Rafinesque. He had connections with the early Smithsonian Institute. He wrote books talking about the wild black Negro tribes that dominated the Americas. So early on, many of these people were talking about all the black folks who were already here in the Americas, and this was very well documented.
Malcolm X's mentor on Africa is a woman by the name of Jewel Mazik, someone I love very much. She died 2007. She's the first black to work in the rare book room for the Library of Congress. They have books that they will not let you see without going through great difficulty, where they have all these pictures of indigenous people who look like Tariq Nasheed.
Down in Peru, in the Inca civilization in ancient times, there was a Native American leader named Tupac Amaru. The rapper Tupac Shakur, his name is Tupac Amaru Shakur. That's where he got his name from. So the phonetic sound Amaru, Amaru Ka, that was a very common name floating around in the Americas before the Europeans came.
Everywhere there was slavery, there were Maroon communities. There were Maroon communities in Brazil, Cuba, of course, Haiti, right here in Florida, right? In Florida, in South Carolina, anywhere there was slavery, there were Maroon sites.
There's many origins of the name America. There's many theories to the origin of the name America. Now, Amerigo Vespucci, many people say that's not his name. Many people say his name was really Alberigo, and he got his name from the Aboriginals here. If you look at many Aboriginal words over here, they have the phonetic sound of America. The Amariske, Amaru, Amaruka.
And you can find this in the book Caribbean History by Tony Martin, one of the master teachers out of the Caribbeans. 1514, they said it was over 7,000 Maroons on the island of Hispaniola alone. And one of the chief Maroons was a brother named Diego. And that brother put in a lot of work over there. He burned down several plantations, freed thousands of enslaved people over on the island of Hispaniola.
There were several Maroons and pirates that assisted Sir Francis Drake. One particular one that always stand out to myself and to others is an African that was a runaway slave, and his name was Diego.
A lot of the black people who would ultimately become Maroons, because if we remember, Maroon is a derivative from a Spanish word cimarron, meaning runaway. And there were many Maroons all through the Americas. Down in Panama, you had Maroons that were battling with the Spanish. Remember, there was a war going on between the Spanish and the Moors. That war was carrying on still over here. So you had people breaking free, living in Maroon colonies with other black aboriginals in South America, here in North America as well.
One of the most, one of the sites that I found extremely impressive was the Palomares. They were located in Brazil, and estimates vary, but some scholars said they had as many as 20,000 people at one time a part of that particular Maroon colony.
Many of the Maroons learned how to ally with different empires against another empire. At one point, the Maroons would ally with the English. Sometimes they would ally with the French. Sometimes they would ally with the Spanish. Later on, that's what they did with the Seminole War. They allied with the Spanish. But early on, they allied with the English against the Spanish. And that's where Sir Francis Drake comes in.
Here in the United States, because of the weather, the climate, they forbid the drum. Because the Europeans here realized the power of the drum. And, I mean, even if you look at what goes on in terms of training, if you looked at the Zulu nation of South Africa, they train by the drum. Their movements by the drum. Even if you look at Pele and soccer, they used to practice soccer playing the drum. So the drum is like the heartbeat of the community.
Sir John Hawkins, he was another English explorer. And when Sir John Hawkins started to get into the slave trade, enslaving black people, his coat of arms on his ship was a captured Moor. A black Moor who was bounded. That was the symbol on his ship. So this was showing the continuation of the war between the Christians and the black Moors. And when Sir John Hawkins started bringing people over here in those slave ships, that's the symbol that he had on the ship.
In the 19th century, if you look at like right around like the 1820s, 1830s, some estimates say that there are about 50,000 rooms that you can find per year, like throughout the Americas.
Sir Francis Drake ended up joining with the Maroons down in Central America against the Spanish because the Maroons were showing the English how to rob the Spanish of gold.
Even when you speak about Sir Francis Drake, right, Sir Francis Drake was able to mobilize a contingency of escaped quote-unquote Maroon Moors, right, who wanted revenge on the Spaniards.
Right.
They never forgot. So freedom wasn't enough.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? They had to circle the wagon and spin the block.
The word comes from the Spanish word for runaways or escape, and it's Cimarron. And so the Spanish had Jamaica first before the English took it. So the English just took the Spanish word Cimarron and applied it, anglicized it as Maroons. Okay. The Seminole is the white Anglo-Saxon anglicizing corruption of Cimarron, which is the Spanish word for runaway. And they can't disprove that. They know where the word comes from. And they say it in some of their literature.
Long Island had a maroon town. Wall Street had a maroon town. Jamaica has a place called Maroon Town. We are all over. We're here now. And we're not going anywhere.
You got to understand, these people, we are agrarian people who always dealt with the ecosystem, always studied the ecosystem. I mean, think about in the Haiti, during the Haitian Revolution, and how when Boukman and Fatima, when they met, I believe it was in a swampy area, and the whites were scared to go back there because of the reptiles that were back there. So we always had a relationship with the ecosystem. So I think they were able to survive. And when I say they, the Native Americans, the Black Seminoles, able to survive because of that relationship.
When the Europeans, when the white supremacists tried to form colonies here in the Americas on their own without black people helping them, they failed every single time. They failed with San Miguel del Guadape. They failed several times in St. Augustine. The French, the Spanish, the English, many of them just kept failing over and over again. And in Roanoke, they had a colony in Roanoke, North Carolina. They failed. The whole village just completely disappeared. Jamestown, that failed until black people came into the picture and started to assist them. So they failed several times here in the Americas trying to get colonies on their own. That's why it's very imperative to understand the importance of black people here in North America and our foundational contributions to the building of America.
The English, of course, their first attempt was Roanoke in the 1580s. And then their settlement, of course, as well, failed. So all three European countries, Spain, France, and England, their first settlements were a failure.
The Roanoke out there with the English in 1585, they consider that the lost colony as well. It's actually the first English child is born here, Virginia Dare. So Virginia Dare actually disappeared. They still honor her to this day. Nobody knows what happened to her. They got all type of websites honoring her, but she disappeared. Some of the early European colonies, what's interesting is the Spanish, the French, the English, all of them failed when they first came here, especially the Spanish. The Spanish were, I mean, they could have received a trophy for failing, brother. They failed so many times.
When the French came, they tried a settlement in near present-day Jacksonville, Florida, called Fort Caroline. And what happens is that the supplies diminished to this settlement, and so the settlement ended up being disbanded, and they actually left the settlement abandoned, and Native Americans moved in for a quick settlement period of time, and then they moved on from the area.
You don't bring inferior subhuman trash to create the new Atlantis. You want to create a new empire, you get the best at the best prices versus getting the sorriest people.
And even Jamestown, I always say it's the reason why they started at 1619. They don't want you to talk about what happened, because they got in Jamestown John Smith in 1607. But they were felling on and off. The natives really were only thing keeping them alive when they first got here. They had something called the Jamestown Starving Times from 1609 to 1610, where they went from 300 to 50. And we have evidence that they even had to start eating each other in order to survive.
There were several European explorers when they came to the Americas. Almost all of the early ones said that they saw black people here in the Americas. Just over and over again, they kept saying they saw black people who looked like the same people from Ethiopia or Africa. That's what they called Africa at the time.
Benjamin Franklin said, hey, we can't deal with those black folk, but we can make Mongoloid people. We can make them honorary whites. See, because remember when the European came over here, there were very few women, white women. So they married Indian women. Mongoloid Indian women, see? And so over time, they took the land away from the black Chickasaw, Blackfeet, whatever. And then they just gave it to the Mongoloid. See, the Mongoloid Indians were the first buffer group that the white man used to, in a sense, try to put us down. He never made treaties with us.
You have Fort Caroline with the French come down in 1564. They end up infighting with the Spanish at St. Augustine. They end up felling. And even St. Augustine, oftentimes they portray that as being the longest running or the oldest American city, but it was felling on and off. The only reason why they consider it that because people kept coming and starting it back over again after it fell in that same location.
The Spanish had a network of gold trading, gold mining down there in Central America, and the black Maroons were showing the English how to get that gold from them. When you see pirate movies like Pirates of the Caribbean, there's a reason why you always see these black Maroons with the pirates, because many of the pirates were actually black themselves. You had people like Black Caesar out there who was in the Caribbean. There's an island called Black Caesar's Rock out there in Florida right now.
Ponce de Leon, who came, Garrado was with him as well, Juan Garrado, but they tried to set up a colony in Florida. They failed. That was 1521. You have, again, Vasquez, who came here in Georgia. He failed. You have actually what they're talking about now at the University of West Florida, the Luna Colony. They're just now discovering this one. They only have bits and pieces of fragments, and they're considering them a success because they lasted 2 years, from 1559 to 1561. Okay, and they have some of their potteries, but they just disappeared overnight. Nobody knows what happened to them.
1513, when Balboa went down to Central America, he said that he saw black people, black Maroons, black Aboriginal people living in certain tribes and villages. Several of these people kept saying how many black Aboriginal tribes they saw. Vasaro, he saw black Aboriginal tribes.
In Massachusetts and in other parts of New England, the indigenous people, if they intermarried too heavily with African people brought over, they would lose their status as Indians. In other words, you had to stay away from blacks.
Gullah Geechee people were descendants of enslaved Africans who ended up settling in the Carolina areas, right along the coast, from North Carolina all the way down to what is now today known as Georgia, right above Florida.
The thing that makes foundational black Americans unique is our connection to Africa and our ancestral connection to the Aboriginal land here. One group that exemplifies that, the Gullah Geechee. The Gullah Geechee name, Gullah, many people say that's an amalgamation of the term Angola, and Geechee, that comes from the Ogeechee River in the South Carolina, Georgia area.
Some of the Maroon societies in the Caribbeans and other places in South America, starting with on the island of Hispaniola. Okay, the first time we see enslaved people brought here on the island of Hispaniola, they talked about how they ran away and set up Maroon colonies. Actually, so much so that King Ferdinand II, I believe it was, in 1514, he actually talks about this, and he says he has to write proposals to deal with the Maroons on the island of Hispaniola.
When black people started to escape from the European powers here in the Americas, many of them would live in the swamps all around the the eastern seaboard and in the south. One of the biggest swamps was the Great Dismal Swamp that's in the Virginia, North Carolina area. This is a huge swamp that black people lived in for centuries. There were some black people living in these swamps that never saw white people before.
The Great Dismal Swamp was an area between the Virginia and present-day Virginia and North Carolina border. When exactly Africans began to abscond from the plantation and go, we aren't actually certain. We don't put a certain date on it, but we know by at least by the 1700s, early 1800s, there were Africans utilizing the Dismal Swamp.
And this is where a lot of people, a very significant rebellion in colonial America, the Chesapeake Rebellion, a lot of those people ran to the Dismal Swamps. So they weren't trying to go north to Canada or other places. They ran to those Dismal Swamps and they stayed and thrived over there.
Because these Indians, they weren't used to a tropical environment. They were not. The black people taught these Muskogees how to survive in Florida because they were familiar with the tropical environment.
The Great Dismal Swamp was an area between that Virginia, North Carolina, the eastern border area. This was a popular area for a lot of not only runaways, but natives. A lot of the black natives hung out there. The Gullah Geechee were known in that area. A lot of the Yamasees and people, the leftover remains of them.
When Nat Turner did his rebellion, they called him on the way to the swamp. That's how they got him, because they knew he was on his way to that Great Dismal Swamp. A lot of people went into that Great Dismal Swamp for refuge.
What they call petite Maroons and grand Maroons. These are Maroons. Petite Maroons are basically Maroons that leave for a short period of time and then end up eventually coming back. But grand Maroonage or grand Maroonage is basically a Maroon that is like, says, I'm leaving the plantation and I'm never coming back. And I'm going to make sure I defend my freedom by any means necessary. And you had a lot of that going on as well.
The Great Dismal Swamp was a safe haven for black people who were escaping slavery and escaping tyranny. And the white supremacists would not go into that Great Dismal Swamp because they knew that they would not come out if they went in there. Because the white supremacists, they're not used to fighting a ground war. The white supremacists, when they fight people, especially Aboriginal people, black people, it has to be an unfair advantage. When they're going into a swamp, you can't bring your horses in there. You can't bring a standing army in there all at once. You can't bring your hunting dogs in there. You have to go in there yourself, and you have to go in there one by one. And that was the advantage that the black Aboriginal Maroons had. They understood that if they came in there one by one, they got them.
The Yamasee is these black folks who came before Columbus, who married into the native population or the Asiatic population who come from the West. Okay? And the Yamasees takes on the British.
In early America, you had a lot of the red Native Americans and you had the black Aboriginal people. And oftentimes, when there was a war going on between the European powers, the red Native Americans would side with the white supremacist European powers against the black Aboriginal people. And this happened in many, many conflicts, especially in the Yamasee conflict with the black Yamasee Native people. They were fighting and they were winning, but the red natives sided with the European powers and undermined the Yamasee, and the Yamasee ended up, many of them became enslaved. And that's how a lot of black people got enslaved, because of the red Native Americans turning on them. And this happened even in Spain. You had the black Muslims and you had the Arab Muslims, and the Arab Muslims were joining with the Christian powers against the black Moors, helping them to enslave the black Moors.
See, there's been a war between the black Muslim and the Arab Muslim for centuries. Still going on.
The Yamasee were Native Americans in present day the Carolinas. They did a lot of intermingling with Africans. They were known to have darker hued skin.
If you look at a lot of images of Native Americans, damn near all of them were jet black. This whole thing of a white Native American or even a light-skinned Native American, that came later on. But the early depictions of Native Americans were almost always either black skin or extremely dark skin. But we're told that all of the Native Americans are the phenotypically red skin, slim nose, straight hair groups. And we know for a fact that there were black Aboriginal people here, wide noses, big lips, big afros, and this is very well documented by many explorers, by many historians.
This was an area that was so popular that the Europeans knew about. There were so many runaways, so many black people in this area. They actually signed this fugitive slave clause in 1730. and they're actually begging the natives, like, go in there and get some of these people. Some natives do it, the Cherokee more specifically, but they're like the Iroquois and people like that, like, nah, they good.
It's really interesting because people don't even realize that Africans, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, had found spaces of generational freedom within the Great Dismal Swamp. There were people that were born there and died there and had children there and grandchildren in this Great Dismal Swamp and defended that territory from outsiders and had no idea what a white man actually looked like. So it's actually it's a pretty interesting story when you really start getting into the Maroons.
People who did not want to be under the English, people who wanted to get away from being enslaved, went there because there are alligators, it's malarial, and people were afraid to come in there, plus the folk were violent. In Massachusetts and in other places, people were denied the right to be who they were. Someone could come through, and if your hair had too much curl in it, you guys aren't Indians anymore. We're white, we said so. Yes. That hasn't changed. The Bureau of Indian Affairs at this very moment refuses to recognize hundreds of indigenous groups based on what's called blood quantum, straight out of Nazi Germany, straight out of apartheid South Africa, straight out of American apartheid.
Because part of the treaty was, we're going to track down black folks and give them back to white folks. And they said, no, you went up to New York and made that deal. They gave you money, but we're not making that deal. We're not selling our brothers and sisters back into slavery.
There were Maroon colonies all around the eastern and southern areas of what would become the United States. But the most infamous Maroons were the people who would become known in history as the Black Seminoles.
That's when the split came between the Creek and the Redtail Creeks. The Redtail Creeks then moved into Florida with the black runaways, the Seminoles. And they became the Cimarron, and they became the Seminole.
So the Great Dismal Swamp, the black people who lived in the Great Dismal Swamp, they lived there really until the late 1800s. They were there for a long time. Well, they were really there until the Civil War. And many of the people came out of the swamp and they assisted in the Civil War.
Early American Republic had money problems. Let's be real. They didn't have an IRS then. They couldn't just take everybody's money. So you fail from the 1790s to 1804 to stop the Haitians, right? You have a war with the Barbary States, that's a war. You're fighting with the Indians all over the place, that's a war. Wars cost money, right? You have the War of 1812, and you have Monroe locking off everything where people couldn't trade. So the early American Republic has real money problems. The Igbo or the Negro Wars in the South threatened the economic future of the country, which increasingly was connected, in fact, it always was connected to the agricultural production of the South more so than any place else.
They saw that there were Mongolian-looking Native Americans, and they saw that there were black-skinned, Negroid-looking Aboriginals here too. And the white supremacists said, hey, we can play on the differences here. The red people, we can give them certain privileges and benefits, and we can get them to help us assist in capturing the other darker people. Now, ultimately, what happened, they would colonize the red-skinned people as well and put them on reservations and basically wipe many of them out. But again, the black Aboriginal people, what happened to them? Where'd they go? They didn't wipe everybody out. The black Aboriginal people are still here. They've just been reclassified as Negro. In the 1790 treaty, many of the Creek Indians, they cut deals with the white supremacists. And part of the deal with the treaty was for the Creeks to turn in black people who are runaways and to turn on the black Aboriginal people. So again, they've always had these little deals where the white supremacists would play divide and conquer based on phenotypical differences.
Seminole Nation was not a distinct Native American nation where some black folks trying to join. No, that's the white folks' mythology. The Seminoles is a nation that came about from the amalgamation of the Southern Creek Muskogee Indians and the black escapees who the Spanish who owned Florida at that time was calling the Cimarron.
And there were many types of swamps like that all around the country. You had swamps in North Carolina, you had swamps in Florida, you had swamps in Mississippi, swamps in New Orleans. In fact, there was a Maroon colony called Hal's Kingdom in Alabama. There was a foundational black American who was enslaved. He got out of slavery, formed his own Maroon colony down there in Alabama called Hal's Kingdom. They still have a lake named after him now called Hal's Lake down there in Alabama.
And with the Edict of 1693, the King of Spain basically says any African that absconds from the English plantations can come into La Florida, and they can live in La Florida free. And they can live in either two ways. They can eke out their own Maroon societies and their own existence in the wilderness, or they could come and live under Spanish rule. And when they established this arrangement where they can live under Spanish rule, they also established Fort Mose.
When many of the early foundational black American rebels started to resist enslavement and tyranny from the white supremacists, they created many networks of underground railroads. But what was the real Underground Railroad?
When people talk about the Underground Railroad, they try to talk about the Underground Railroad going north into Canada. And that wasn't necessarily the case for all runaway enslaved black people. They talk about the Underground Railroad going into Canada because many white abolitionists were helping out with that endeavor. And they don't want to show that black people were freeing themselves going down into the South. That's where the real Underground Railroad was. Black people going into those swamps. Black people freeing themselves without the help of anybody and living in independent black-run societies.
When they give us the Underground Railroad story of the East Coast, it involves the Amish. It has the white savior complex. John Brown, he's highlighted. Harriet Tubman, she's highlighted, and things of that nature. You know, the fact that people were taking us in and taking care of us and hiding us. You know, they put that in there, and that opens up. That's the beginning of the quote-unquote ally myth.
At one point, so many foundational black Americans were emancipating themselves in the Carolinas and running down into Florida. Officials had to make Georgia a state in an attempt to neutralize this predicament.
So Georgia became a state essentially because there was a man by the name of James Oglethorpe, and he had two missions. One of his missions was to find a way to relieve England of some of their debtors, right? So he wanted to make sure he can establish a colony where English people can come and pay off their debts. He wanted to put this colony in an area where there wasn't going to be slavery permitted, because if there's slavery permitted in certain areas, slavery takes away jobs from poor whites, right? So he says, we can kill two birds with one stone. Since we constantly have Africans running away from the Carolinas into Florida, we can establish this debtor colony without slavery as a buffer between the Carolinas and Florida.
The Yamasee people, first and foremost, they were always a people that Europeans and even other native tribes considered as a very, very dark-complected people. The Creeks, one of their main enemies, will refer to their women as the daughters of the sun. Okay, so these were very black-complected people.
The Maroons in those areas who did populate the Great Dismal Swamp and South Sea Islands, I would argue that they did cognizantly understand how to utilize terrain. They worked with the Yamasee, who knew the way to be able to utilize the terrain in the landscape. So that's really important, and really being able to understand not only how to escape, but how to survive in those areas.
We named it after Harriet Tubman, Tubman City, because she used to come through. Moses used to come on through. And Harriet Tubman is a Maroon, you know. Nat Turner is a Maroon.
So a lot of the people in the that are Gullah, Geechee, are folks who come from West Africa who have a lot of exposure to malaria and other tropical diseases, which gives them a degree of immunity from malaria and dengue that whites don't have.
What grew on the riverbanks? Rice. But what is that? Water. Ditches and ditches and ditches of water for hundreds of miles. Who lived there? The malaria mosquito. So the white man can't stay there during the warm weather. So he can only come into the rice belt, physically come in between October and the end of February. So from March to October, black folks is running their own lives. Right? We got our own village. Yes, the black men are the overseers, but we're working, we're maintaining our culture. We're maintaining our language, we're maintaining our food, we're maintaining our village, The whites can only come in. They didn't have a cure or anything to help them. So they can only come in when it wasn't warm enough for the mosquito. That's October to March. So you have this isolated black population.
But the Gullah Geechee, it's a group of islands, St. Helena, St. James, Beaufort, where Africans were. In fact, there are people that say the Civil War started on Beaufort. Lincoln gave Beaufort to black people. That was part of what started the Civil War.
Even Nat Turner, when they were looking for him, he was trying to get to the Dismal Swamp. They dispatched the United States Marines to keep Nat Turner from getting in there. They were terrified he's going to bring the crazy niggas out. And they go, I mean, it's bad enough what he did with 50 people. What would he do with folks who don't give a damn?
The Spanish government let the Maroons know if you went into Florida that you would be free. You can get your freedom if you went into Florida. The United States government did not like this. They understood what this meant. This could be another rise of the Moors. So they had to stop this at all costs.
Because that's who we are. You can put us anywhere in the world. We are survivors. You're talking about women that were midwives, for example, that would take this Spanish moss off of this tree. And they knew, based on being at home in Africa, that there are 72 nutrients in the Spanish moss. They would take that moss, they would pull it off of the tree. That's a parasite. They knew that. The women from the Geechee tribe, Liberia, for example, would take that moss off of this tree, these trees, and they would wash it, and they would cut it and place it in the sun so the red ants can die. And 2 to 3 weeks before a woman was to have a baby, they would make a tea and she would sip it. So they turned that parasite into a long-suffering tea. And this long-suffering tea did the opposite. It gave them an ability to have short suffering when they had children. It makes your contractions come back to back.
You had Maroons from all different stations who said, I'm going to get free. Women left with children. Some women were pregnant. Hell, some people had disabilities, physical disabilities. It was rumored that it was a brother named Caesar. They said Caesar had no legs, but he left the plantation crawling. You had some brothers and sisters who were running who had iron yokes around their necks. They had chains on their feet.
And so by the time the United States is developed and becomes a country, they are now directly involved with this idea of all of these runaways that are now still trickling and coming in to Florida. So they saw Florida as a direct threat to the plantation economy and to the overall economy of the United States.
This is a thing that people have to understand. What you call an Indian, a lot of that has been hijacked by whites deliberately intermarrying with the elite matrilineal groups of the various so-called 5 civilized tribes. And so like even now, the people who are Indians are really biologically mostly white people. And so you had white Indians, if there is such a thing, basically working with Anglo-whites to screw the blood Indians, and then the Indians mix with blacks and so forth.
The Cherokee actually flipped sides. And the Cherokee flipped sides, and this turned the tide of the war. So once they flipped sides, they were able to regroup using a lot of raids and different things. And the Yamasee end up eventually losing that war. Some of those folks stayed and kind of went to that Dismal Swamp area. Most of them moved down south. And this is where we get the Seminoles. There was a man by the name of William Simons. He wrote a book called East Florida, an account of the Seminoles. And he said the Seminoles were the descendants of the Yamasees.
Seminoles formed as a distinct tribe very gradually, right? So if you go all the way back to 1693, the Spanish had an edict encouraging runaways to enter into Florida because they'd already been doing that on their own will. When South Carolina was created, it's actually called Carolina at the time, they were starting to import a massive amount of Africans into the colony. Immediately, Africans do what they do. They escape slavery, and they're looking for a place where they can find some kind of freedom. What ends up happening is the Spanish realize this, and the Spanish are enemies of the British at the time, and they're saying, whatever the English or the British lose, we, as the Spanish, can gain to our own advantage. So this edict was basically saying, all runaways, self-emancipating Africans that make their way into Florida can end up having their freedom as long as they defend and protect Florida from the encroaching British who are always coming down into this area.
Let's talk about the Treaty of 1790. It was led by a man named Alexander McGillivray. He was actually half Creek Native American and half Scottish. He and about 26 other Creek Native Americans went to establish this treaty. Now, one of the key things that McGillivray agreed to was that they would turn over runaway slaves. As Spain and Britain continued to battle for territory and battle for power, Spain saw an opportunity that was presented by the runaway slaves coming out of Georgia, South Carolina, into the region that we now know as Florida. So in 1693, it was King Charles II of Spain who issued an edict, and he used Catholicism as a guise to basically come up with an excuse to not return any runaway slaves who made it into their territory. So the idea was, as long as you convert to Catholicism and you agree to take up arms for the Spanish crown, you as a black person could live free once you arrived in what's now known as Florida.
As a matter of fact, the word Seminole has its origins in the word Cimarron. It doesn't mean Native American. It's not a pre-colonial Native American tribe. Cimarron was a word that they used to use to describe runaway slaves, or runaway cattle, really, originally, that ran up into the mountains. But then they used this word to describe runaway slaves running up into the mountains. The word Cimarron is the word Cima, and Cima means up on top. This word eventually became adopted by the British, and they took off the scene part and said the word maroon.
And then they found gold in North Georgia, and that changed everything.
The Blue Ridge Mountains.
The Blue Ridge Mountains, right, which was the first gold rush.
1793, they came up with the first Fugitive Slave Act. They were working, as you create this new society, the so-called American Republic, what to do with the people that they hated the most, which is blacks and Indians, divide and conquer, exacerbate differences. And what they did with the Creeks is say, hey man, you guys are learning how to farm, you're taking white names, you're intermarrying, sort of like what they're doing with the Latinos, they're building them up for a knockdown. It's the same process. First they embrace you and then they choke you. They began to say, we like you guys, and we're going to respect the treaties, and you're going to get to keep your land, but you know what? Y'all got to give us all our niggas back and run to you, okay? That's in Article 1.
These Maroon communities were organized. We had our own government. We traded with colonists and also pirates. We traded with different people, Native Americans. We had our own laws, our own politics. So these were organized communities, but white historians and scholars and writers would have you think that it was a bunch of savages running around in the forest and in the bush and in the mountains.
Where the Seminoles are considered a distinct tribe it's kind of a tricky question there, because they aren't acknowledged by the English until the 1750s. Now they began to formulate about 40 years prior to that, but it isn't until the 1750s that they are recognized.
But in the 1712, we get the Stoner Rebellion, one of the first major rebellions in the 1700s. And what are they doing? Trying to make their way to where? Florida, to become a part of that nation that we know today as the Seminoles. So when we connect the dots, we realize this is not something that popped up in 1812 or 1814 with Andrew Jackson. This is a process that's gone on for almost 150 years before Andrew Jackson.
So there was a treaty in the year 1790 that basically stated that if the Creek capture runaways for the U.S. government, then they will be allotted a certain amount of land and things like that. But there were two factions of Creeks. Not all Creeks agreed to do this, obviously. You had the Red Stick Creek, who were more the northern Creek, and then you had the southern Creek, who allied themselves with the U.S. government.
In 1814, the British built a fort in Florida overlooking the Apalachicola River. When the British withdrew from the fort in 1815, the structure was soon taken over by black Maroon fighters, and the location eventually became known as Fort Negro.
You got to understand, here in Georgia, they had to petition the government to do something about Fort Negro, because a lot of the free slaves was heading that way. They was coming from all over because they knew in this settlement they were safe.
They are left this fort to defend themselves and to live as free individuals. And they saw this as a direct threat because, of course, during those times, a fort meant that you were on your way to becoming an established colony. And so they felt that as long as there was a safe haven where Africans and African descendants were living free and thriving, then that was a direct threat to plantation society.
You need to go back to right here in Savannah, Georgia, the War of Jenkins' Ear, where an English captain had his ear cut off by Spanish, who said, take this back to the king and show him what we think about him. And a couple years, about 8 years after that, you got this war that dragged for quite a while. And what ended up happening is that Oglethorpe, the founder of the Georgia colony for poor white trash, and the more things stay the same, right? Oglethorpe set up a place near St. Augustine called Fort Mose.
So what ends up happening now is a lot of these Africans end up going and they end up teaming up with a lot of the Creek, the Red Stick Creeks. So all the Red Stick Creeks and these Africans are all working together, and they commit an assault on one of the forts right outside of Bainbridge, Georgia. And in retaliation, Andrew Jackson, he ends up coming in and starts committing assaults to a lot of the Seminole villages.
Jackson and his territorial expansion, he essentially wanted to make sure that he wiped out all resistance because it was catching on in all of the areas. It became, all of the holdings that the Europeans had were picking up on what the Maroons had done.
The white supremacist powers understand once a society frees themselves and once they establish a fort is the next step to establishing a nation in your own country. And the Europeans could not have a black independent nation. So they had to stop that at all costs. So these are the seeds of the First Seminole War.
Andrew Jackson, remember, Andrew Jackson is known as the Indian killer because he had made a name for himself fighting the black Indians, you know. And then remember, he was able, in a sense, to send all the Mongoloid Indians out west, Oklahoma. And so then, therefore, in a sense, he wanted to concentrate on a stronghold, which was down in Florida. And so there's so many people was going down there trying to get their slaves back. And when they went to get their slaves, most of them got killed off.
So the Africans would split their harvest with the Creek Nation. And of course, over time, intermarriage take place between nations, as any neighbors would do. And so a big part of that relationship between the Africans and the Creeks, people say, well, the Creeks had some of them as enslaved people, but the Native American concept of enslavement was completely different from the European. It did not take away your identity as a human being. You had a labor you had to pay, but you could live in your village. Just bring me some vegetable at the end of harvest. It'll be cool. And so that was the arrangements many of them had.
So Fort Negro was a stronghold that was actually put up by the British in 1812, but ultimately they abandoned. It was then taken up by free blacks and Maroons under the leadership of a black leader named Garcon. He actually had military training from his former duties with the British Marines. So that presented a very threatening situation for U.S. forces, because now you have these freed blacks who are united at this strong fort. They have these leftover weapons and arsenals that the British left behind, and they're all united behind a leader who has the know-how to bring them together and really bring the fight to the U.S.
So what ends up happening is Andrew Jackson and generals like Edmund Gaines and others, they're saying, like, we got to do something about this fort. So they go down into Florida and they first commit assaults on the fort in the summer of 1816.
Fort Negro was on the Apalachicola River. Apalachicola River set up in Florida. Fort Negro was actually given to them after the War of 1812 with the British. So the British had this own fort. Once they abandoned it, they lost the war. A brother by the name of Garcon took over Fort Negro, okay? And this was essentially a power hub for a lot of runaways.
So the British built this fort as a home and a protection for the blacks who fought with them in the War of 1812. And that's why Andrew Jackson wanted to destroy it. And so when they attack it, I think it was in the third volley, they hit the magazine. And the magazine blew up and destroyed the fort.
The Black Seminoles tried to have a toe-to-toe battle with the U.S. government from Fort Negro. The U.S.